May I have what you didn't finish? The little girl's voice cut through the silence of the upscale restaurant like a prayer meant to be ignored. The woman in pearls froze, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, the bubbles catching the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of downtown Chicago's skyline. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from, or what time it is where you are. Let this story touch your heart today. Margaret Thompson had never seen anything like this in her 62 years of life. Not here. Not at the Sterling Club, where membership cost more than most people earned in a year. Where the waitstaff wore white gloves and spoke in hushed tones. Where women like her came to be seen and admired for their charitable donations and society connections. The child standing beside her table couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her dress, if the torn oversized garment hanging from her tiny shoulders could be called that, was at least 3 sizes too big, secured around her waist with what looked like a piece of rope. Her shoes didn't match. One black sneaker with holes in the toe, one brown boot that had seen better decades, but it was her eyes that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. They were ancient eyes in a baby's face. Eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that should have been filled with wonder and mischief, but instead held the weary resignation of someone who had learned that disappointment was the only reliable constant in life. Margaret glanced around the restaurant, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around her glass. The other diners, distinguished men in $1,000 suits, discussing mergers over aged steaks, women her age wearing jewelry that could fund small countries, seemed to have developed sudden blindness. Conversations continued without pause. Silverware clinked against china. The child might as well have been invisible. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, her voice softer than it had been in years, softer than it had been since she'd learned to speak in the clipped, efficient tones that commanded respect in boardrooms and charity galas. "Emily," the girl whispered, her small hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. "Emily Grace." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow, stirring memories she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they were dreams. Emily Grace. It couldn't be. Not after all these years. Not after everything that had happened. "Where's your mother, Emily?" The child's chin trembled, but she lifted it with a dignity that broke Margaret's heart. "She died when I was little. Cancer, they said. I don't remember her much, but I have this." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small tarnished locket, its chain broken, its surface scratched from being clutched by desperate fingers too many times to count. Margaret's world tilted. She knew that locket. She had given it to Caroline 25 years ago, when they were both young women fresh out of college, when the world seemed full of possibilities, and their friendship felt unbreakable. Caroline had worn it every day, touching it unconsciously whenever she was nervous or excited or sad. "May I see that?" Margaret's voice barely qualified as sound. Emily hesitated, then placed the locket in Margaret's outstretched palm. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened it. Inside, faded but still visible, was a tiny photograph of 2 young women with their arms around each other, laughing at something the camera couldn't capture. One was Caroline. Beautiful, radiant Caroline with her wild curls and infectious smile. The other was Margaret herself, 25 years younger, her eyes bright with hopes and dreams that had long since been buried under layers of social expectations and calculated ambitions. "Your mother," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Caroline was your mother." Emily's eyes widened. "You knew my mama. She was my best friend, my sister in every way that mattered." Margaret's vision blurred as memories flooded back, late-night conversations about the futures they would build, promises to be godmothers to each other's children, plans to grow old together on adjacent porches, watching their grandchildren play in shared backyards. But life had intervened. Margaret had married Richard Thompson, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, and moved into a world of charity boards and social obligations. Caroline had married a struggling artist and chosen love over security. Their friendship had stretched thin across the distance between their different worlds, and then snapped entirely when pride and misunderstanding created wounds too deep to heal. "I tried to find you," Margaret said, her voice hollow with regret. "When your mother got sick, when she called me that last time, I was overseas, a business trip that seemed so important then. By the time I got back, she was gone, and you had disappeared into the system. I hired investigators. I spent months looking, but your father—" "He's not my father," Emily said with surprising firmness. "He's the man who sold me." The words hung in the air like a curse. Margaret felt something cold and terrible settle in her stomach. Sold you? Emily nodded, her small face grave beyond her years. To different people, for money. They said I was supposed to work, to earn my keep, but I always ran away. That's why I'm here now. I ran away again. Margaret looked at this child, this brave, broken little girl who shared the face of her dearest friend, and felt 25 years of carefully constructed walls crumble to dust. The woman in pearls, the society matron, the perfect wife who attended the right parties and said the right things, ceased to exist. What remained was simply Margaret, remembering the promise she'd made to a dying friend, a promise she'd failed to keep. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Not without me." She stood up, her chair scraping against the polished floor, loud enough to draw stares from nearby tables. She didn't care. For the first time in decades, she didn't care what anyone thought. "Come with me, Emily Grace, we're going home." As they walked toward the exit, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "Don't forget the Henderson reception tonight. Very important for my campaign." She turned off the phone without responding and took Emily's small hand in hers. Some things, she realized, were more important than being important. Margaret's penthouse apartment on Michigan Avenue had always been her sanctuary, a carefully curated display of wealth and taste that spoke to her position in Chicago's elite social circles. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across marble floors. Original paintings worth more than most people's houses hung on walls covered in silk wallpaper. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that required a full-time staff to maintain. But as Emily stood in the doorway, still clutching her broken locket, the opulence felt obscene. Margaret saw her home through the child's eyes, the excess, the waste, the cold beauty that had never known the warmth of a child's laughter or the chaos of a family dinner. "Are you really rich?" Emily asked, her voice echoing in the vast foyer. Margaret paused, her hand still on the door handle. "I suppose I am." "Then why didn't you help my mama when she was sick?" The question hit like a slap, direct and devastating in the way only children could deliver truth. Margaret's throat constricted. How could she explain the pride that had kept her from reaching out, the social expectations that had made Caroline's struggles seem like choices rather than circumstances, the fear that offering help would be seen as condescension? "I didn't know how sick she was," Margaret said finally, the words tasting like ash. "And when I did find out, it was too late." Emily nodded, with the accepting sadness of someone who had learned that adults often failed the people they claimed to love. She wandered into the living room, her small fingers trailing along surfaces that probably cost more than she'd ever seen in her short life. "Mama used to talk about you," Emily said, picking up a crystal figurine and examining it with careful hands. "She said you were the smartest person she ever knew. She said you could fix anything." "I couldn't fix what mattered most," Margaret whispered. That evening, while Emily slept in the guest bedroom wearing one of Margaret's silk nightgowns that engulfed her tiny frame like a tent, Margaret sat at her kitchen island with Caroline's locket open before her. She traced the faces in the photograph with her finger, remembering the day it was taken. They had been at Navy Pier, celebrating Caroline's acceptance to art school. Margaret had been heading to business school. They had made promises that day, to stay friends forever, to be each other's children's godmothers, to never let success or failure come between them. She had broken every single promise. Her phone rang, jolting her from her memories. Richard's name flashed on the screen. "Where the hell are you?" His voice carried the controlled fury he used when he was trying not to cause a scene in public. "The Hendersons are asking about you. Do you know how important this fundraiser is for my Senate campaign?" "I'm at home." "Then get dressed and get down here now." Margaret looked toward the guest bedroom where Emily was sleeping. Really sleeping, for what was probably the first time in months. The child had eaten 3 helpings of the simple pasta dinner Margaret had prepared, her hunger so profound it was painful to witness. "I can't come tonight, Richard." The silence on the other end stretched so long she wondered if the call had dropped. "You can't come?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Margaret, my dear, I think you've forgotten who pays for that apartment, who funds your little charity work, who makes your comfortable life possible. A child needs me." "What child? What are you talking about?" Margaret closed her eyes. "Caroline's daughter. She's 7 years old, and she's been living on the streets. She's here now, and she needs care." "Caroline, that artist friend from college? The one who chose poverty over common sense?" Richard's laugh was sharp and cold. "Send her to social services. That's what they're for. She's been through the system, Richard. It failed her. I'm not going to fail her again. Again? Margaret, you have responsibilities. To me, to my career, to our position in this community. You can't just adopt some street child on a whim. She's not some street child. She's Caroline's daughter. And this isn't a whim. Then it's temporary. A week, maybe 2, until proper arrangements can be made. Margaret opened the locket again, staring at the young women they had been. No, Richard. It's not temporary. The conversation that followed was brutal in its clarity. Richard laid out exactly what Margaret's defiance would cost her. The apartment, the credit cards, the social standing, the comfortable life she had built over 25 years of being the perfect political wife. He spoke of her obligations, her duties, the image they had to maintain. He threatened divorce, financial ruin, social exile. When he finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I understand, she said finally. Good. Then I understand that I've spent 25 years being someone I don't recognize. I understand that I chose comfort over love, status over friendship, appearance over truth. I understand that I let my best friend die alone because I was too proud to pick up the phone. Margaret, and I understand that I'm done. She hung up the phone and turned it off. The next morning, Emily woke to the smell of pancakes. Real pancakes, made from scratch. Not the packaged mix she was used to in the few foster homes that had bothered to feed her breakfast at all. She found Margaret in the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's designer dress but with an apron tied over it, her perfectly styled hair now loose around her shoulders. I've never made pancakes before, Margaret admitted, sliding a slightly lopsided stack onto a plate. But I thought you might like them. Emily climbed onto the bar stool, her legs swinging freely, and took a bite. Her eyes widened. These are really good! Margaret smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. I called the school district this morning. There's an elementary school 6 blocks away. I thought we could walk over and get you enrolled. You mean I can go to school, real school, every day, and you'll have your own room, your own clothes, your own everything. Emily's face crumpled, and for a moment Margaret thought she had said something wrong. But then she realized the child was crying from joy, not sadness. Nobody ever wanted to keep me before, Emily whispered. They all said I was too much trouble. Margaret knelt beside the chair, taking Emily's small hands in hers. You're not trouble, sweetheart. You're a gift. A gift I was too foolish to recognize before. That afternoon, they went shopping for school clothes and supplies. Margaret watched Emily's wonder at being allowed to choose her own backpack, her own notebooks, her own pencils. Such simple things, things Margaret had always taken for granted, but to Emily they were treasures. In the children's clothing section, Emily picked out simple, practical items: jeans, t-shirts, sneakers. Nothing fancy, nothing that would make her stand out. When Margaret suggested a pretty dress, Emily shook her head. Pretty things get taken away, she said matter-of-factly, or they make people angry. Margaret's heart broke a little more. How many homes had this child been in? How many people had promised to care for her only to disappoint her? How many times had she learned that attachment led to abandonment? That evening, Richard came home. He stood in the doorway of the living room, where Margaret was helping Emily with a coloring book, his face a mask of cold disapproval. I see you haven't come to your senses, he said. Emily looked up from her crayons, studying this tall, severe man in his expensive suit. She had learned to read adult faces quickly. It was a survival skill, and she didn't like what she saw in his. You must be Emily, Richard said, his voice falsely pleasant. I'm Richard. I'm Margaret's husband. Hello, Emily said quietly, moving closer to Margaret. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Tell me, Emily, do you know how much it costs to live in a place like this? Do you understand the kind of money it takes to buy clothes and food and send little girls to school? Richard, Margaret's voice was warning. No, I think she should understand, he continued. I think she should know that every meal she eats, every toy she plays with, every comfort she enjoys comes from my generosity. And generosity, Emily, can be withdrawn just as easily as it's given. Emily's small hand found Margaret's, her fingers cold despite the warm apartment. That's enough, Margaret said, standing. Emily, why don't you go get ready for bed? I'll be there in a few minutes to read you a story. After Emily left the room, Richard turned to his wife with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had proven his point. Do you see how quickly she'll learn to fear losing what she has? How easily she can be controlled? That's what charity really is, Margaret. Control. And right now, I control everything in your life, including hers. Margaret looked at this man she had married. This stranger who spoke of a 7-year-old child as if she were a political problem to be managed, and felt the last remnants of her old life crumble away. "Not anymore," she said quietly. "You don't control anything anymore." The war for Emily's future was about to begin. The lawyers arrived on a Tuesday morning, like vultures circling fresh carrion. Margaret watched from her living room window as 3 black sedans pulled up to the building, disgorging men in charcoal suits carrying briefcases that probably cost more than most people's cars. She knew what was coming. Richard had warned her the night before with the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather. "So you have until noon to change your mind," he had said, straightening his tie in their bedroom mirror. "After that, things become unpleasant." Emily was at her first day of school, blissfully unaware that her new life was already under attack. Margaret had walked her to Lincoln Elementary that morning, watching with a mixture of joy and heartbreak as Emily's face lit up at the sight of other children, playground equipment, the normalcy she had been denied for so long. "Will you be here when school ends?" Emily had asked, her small hand tight in Margaret's. "I'll be here," Margaret had promised. "I'll always be here." Now, as the lawyers filed into her building, she prayed it was a promise she could keep. The doorbell rang at exactly 11:47 a.m. Margaret opened the door to find 3 men and 1 woman, all wearing expressions of professional sympathy that didn't reach their eyes. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Vale, whom Margaret recognized from Richard's political circles, smiled with the warmth of a shark. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as expensive. "May we come in? We have some documents that require your immediate attention." They spread papers across her dining room table like dealers, laying out a particularly vicious hand of cards. Divorce papers, of course, but that wasn't the worst of it. Richard was claiming she had suffered a mental breakdown, that her sudden obsession with rescuing a strange child was evidence of diminished capacity. He was seeking a psychiatric evaluation, questioning her ability to make rational decisions. But the cruelest blow was the custody petition. "Your husband has filed for emergency temporary guardianship of the minor child," Vale explained, his manicured finger tracing the legal text. "He argues that you've created an unstable environment, that you're emotionally unfit to care for a traumatized child who requires professional intervention." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "He doesn't want Emily. He's made that crystal clear. Mr. Thompson is deeply concerned about the child's welfare," the female attorney, introduced as Patricia Brennan, said with practiced sincerity. "He believes the appropriate course is immediate placement with a qualified foster family while proper procedures are followed." "Back into the system," Margaret said flatly. "Back to the place that failed her before. The system has protocols, Mrs. Thompson, safeguards, background checks, professional oversight." Brennan's tone suggested Margaret was naive for thinking love might be more important than paperwork. Vale leaned forward, his expression shifting to something that might have been genuine concern if you didn't know better. "Mrs. Thompson, your husband wants to give you every opportunity to reconsider. This could all go away if you simply acknowledge that your impulse to help this child, while admirable, was perhaps not well thought out. And if I don't, then we proceed with the psychiatric evaluation, the custody hearing, the media attention that will inevitably follow when it becomes public that the wife of a Senate candidate has been declared mentally unfit to care for a child." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "It won't just destroy your reputation, Mrs. Thompson. It will destroy any chance this little girl has of finding a stable home with a reputable family." The threat was elegant in its cruelty. Fight for Emily, and ensure that no decent family would ever want to adopt a child connected to such a scandal. Give her up voluntarily, and she might have a chance at normalcy somewhere else. Margaret stared at the papers, each word a small knife cutting away at her resolve. 25 years of marriage had taught her exactly how ruthless Richard could be when his interests were threatened, but she had never imagined he would weaponize a child's future. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Vale said, checking his expensive watch. "You have until 3 p.m. when school lets out. Either you sign the voluntary relinquishment papers, or we file the emergency petition and have the child removed by social services." They left their business cards arranged on her table like a declaration of war, each one representing another way Richard could destroy her life. When the door closed behind them, Margaret sank into her chair and finally allowed herself to cry, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, from the place where all her regrets and failures lived. She thought about calling her own lawyer, but Richard controlled their joint accounts. Her personal checking account had maybe $3,000, not enough for the kind of legal battle this would require. She thought about calling friends, but realized with horrifying clarity that she didn't have any real friends, only social acquaintances whose loyalty would evaporate the moment scandal touched her. The isolation was complete, deliberate. She had allowed herself to become so dependent on Richard's world that she had no resources of her own when that world turned against her. At 2:30, she walked to Lincoln Elementary with lead in her stomach and broken glass in her throat. Emily came running out of the school building with her new backpack bouncing, her face radiant with the joy of someone who had spent 6 hours being treated like she mattered. "Margaret! Margaret! I made a friend. Her name is Sophia, and she has a puppy, and she invited me for a play date, and Mrs. Henderson says I'm really smart and—" Emily's words tumbled over each other in her excitement, but they died when she saw Margaret's face. "What's wrong?" Margaret knelt down to Emily's level, taking her small hands in her own. Around them, other children were being picked up by parents who didn't have to explain why the world was about to end. "Emily, sweetheart, do you remember what I told you about how sometimes adults make mistakes?" Emily's eyes went wide and knowing, the joy draining from her face like water from a broken cup. "You don't want me anymore." "No!" Margaret's voice was fierce. "No, that's not it at all. I want you more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. But there are people who say I'm not the right person to take care of you. Because I'm broken?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. This 7-year-old child, who had been abandoned and abused and passed from home to home like unwanted furniture, believed she was the problem. "You are not broken," Margaret said, her voice shaking with the force of her conviction. "You are perfect and beautiful and brave and smart, and anyone who doesn't see that is blind. Then why can't I stay with you?" Margaret pulled Emily into her arms, holding her tight against the wind that was picking up, carrying the first hints of winter. Because sometimes the people with the most power aren't the people with the most love. They sat on a bench outside the school, watching other families head home to dinner and homework, and the 1,000 small rituals that made up a normal life. Emily was quiet for a long time, her small body pressed against Margaret's side. "Will you visit me?" she asked finally. "If they let me, will you remember me?" Margaret's heart broke completely. "Emily Grace, I will remember you every day for the rest of my life, and someday, when I figure out how to fix this, I will find you again." Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out the broken locket, Caroline's locket, and pressed it into Margaret's hand. "Keep this safe for me." Margaret nodded, unable to speak around the grief lodged in her throat. At 3:47 p.m., the social services van pulled up. The caseworker was a tired-looking woman in her 50s who had clearly done this too many times. She was gentle with Emily, explaining that this was just temporary, that someone would find her a wonderful family, that everything would work out fine. Emily didn't cry. She just picked up her new backpack, the one Margaret had bought her just 2 days ago, and walked toward the van with the resigned dignity of someone who had learned that good things always ended. At the van door, she turned back. "Margaret." "Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for the pancakes." Margaret watched the van drive away until it disappeared around the corner, taking with it the only piece of Caroline she had left, the only chance she'd had to keep a promise that mattered. That night, alone in her apartment that suddenly felt like a mausoleum, Margaret sat at her kitchen counter with Caroline's locket open in her palm. The photographs inside seemed to mock her. 2 young women who had believed they could conquer the world, who had made promises they were too naive to understand. She had failed Caroline twice now, once when she was dying, and again when her daughter needed saving. But as she sat there in the darkness, something began to crystallize in her chest. Not acceptance, not surrender, rage. Pure, clean, focused rage at a system that protected money over children, at a man who would destroy a little girl's life to maintain his political image, at a world that had taught her to be helpless in the face of power. Margaret Thompson, the perfect political wife, might not have been able to fight back, but the woman who had once promised Caroline she would move heaven and earth for the people she loved, that woman was still in there somewhere, and she was done being quiet. The next morning brought Richard's victory parade disguised as concerned intervention. He arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with an entourage that looked like a hostile takeover. Dr. Miranda Faulkner, a psychiatrist whose credentials were as impressive as her hourly rate. James Morrison, Richard's campaign manager whose smile never reached his calculating eyes. And Patricia Brennan, the lawyer who spoke about Emily like she was a problematic tax code. "Margaret, darling," Richard said, kissing her cheek with the performance of affection he'd perfected for cameras, "I've brought some people who want to help us through this difficult time." Dr. Faulkner was a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and the kind of clinical detachment that made Margaret feel like a specimen under a microscope. She settled into Margaret's living room as if she owned it, pulling out a tablet and stylus with the efficiency of someone who had reduced human suffering to billable hours. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand you've been under tremendous stress lately," Dr. Faulkner began, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who dealt with wealthy people's problems. "Suddenly taking responsibility for a troubled child, making impulsive decisions, experiencing what your husband describes as emotional volatility. These can all be symptoms of a psychological break." "I haven't had a psychological break," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "I've had a moral awakening." James Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. As Richard's campaign manager, he understood the optics better than anyone. A Senate candidate's wife having a public breakdown over a homeless child was exactly the kind of human interest story that could derail political ambitions. "Mrs. Thompson," Morrison said, leaning forward with the earnest expression he used for town halls, "we all admire your compassion. It speaks to your character, to the kind of first lady you would make. But there are proper channels for helping disadvantaged children, established charities, professional organizations. Like the system that failed Emily for 7 years? The child has special needs," Patricia Brennan interjected, consulting her tablet. "According to the preliminary assessment, she shows signs of attachment disorder, possible PTSD, behavioral issues stemming from institutional neglect. She requires specialized care that, frankly, Mrs. Thompson, you're not qualified to provide." Margaret felt the walls closing in around her, each professional opinion another nail in the coffin of her hopes. They spoke about Emily like she was a problem to be solved rather than a child to be loved, reducing her to a list of symptoms and deficits that justified their predetermined conclusion. "Where is she now?" Margaret asked. "Safe," Richard said, "in a professional group home with trained counselors who specialize in children from difficult backgrounds. She's receiving the kind of structured care she needs." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unfamiliar, but the words made her blood run cold. "She cries for you every night. She won't eat. They think she's being defiant, but she's just heartbroken. A friend." She stared at the message, her hands trembling. Someone at the group home was reaching out, someone who saw Emily not as a case file but as a grieving child. "The good news, Dr. Faulkner continued, oblivious to Margaret's distress, is that this kind of episode is often triggered by hormonal changes associated with menopause, combined with empty nest syndrome. With proper medication and therapy, we can help you regain perspective." "Perspective," Margaret repeated flatly. "Yes, the understanding that while your desire to help is admirable, it was based on an emotional reaction rather than rational thinking. You are responding to your own psychological needs rather than the child's actual best interests." Richard sat back with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan was working perfectly. He had assembled the right experts, crafted the right narrative, positioned himself as the reasonable husband trying to help his unstable wife. In his world, this was how problems got solved, with enough money and influence to reshape reality until it served your purposes. "I've arranged for a private clinic," he said, "very discreet, very comfortable. A month of rest and evaluation, and then you can return to your normal life. The charity work, the social obligations, the role you were meant to play." Margaret looked around the room at these people who spoke about her life like they owned it, who had reduced Emily's suffering to an inconvenience and her love to a symptom. She thought about the little girl somewhere across the city, crying herself to sleep in another institutional bed, believing once again that she wasn't worth keeping. "No," she said quietly. The room fell silent. Dr. Faulkner looked up from her tablet. Morrison glanced nervously at Richard. Patricia Brennan's pen stopped moving across her legal pad. "I'm sorry?" Richard's voice carried a dangerous edge. "I said no." Margaret stood up, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not going to your clinic. I'm not taking your medication. And I'm not abandoning Emily again." Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold fury underneath. "Margaret, you're not thinking clearly. That's exactly why you need professional help." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 25 years. Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the city where Emily was somewhere out there, alone and afraid. I spent decades letting you and people like you tell me what was important, what mattered, how I should spend my time and energy and love. I built my life around your ambitions, your image, your definition of success. And look what that life gave you, Morrison said, gesturing around the expensive apartment. Security, respect, influence, the ability to help people through proper channels. Margaret turned back to face them, and something in her expression made Dr. Faulkner close her tablet. It gave me everything except what mattered, Margaret said. It gave me wealth but not richness, status but not significance, a role but not a purpose. You're having a breakdown, Richard said, his voice tight with controlled panic. You're not yourself. No, Margaret said, her voice quiet but certain. For the first time in decades, I am exactly myself. The woman Caroline used to know. The woman who made promises and meant them. The woman who believed love was more important than appearances. She walked to her purse and pulled out her phone, holding it so they could all see the screen. I'm going to call the media, every reporter, every news station, every blogger who would be interested in a story about a Senate candidate who uses his political connections to separate a woman from a child she's trying to protect. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went white. Morrison looked like he might vomit. Even Dr. Faulkner seemed to understand that the dynamics in the room had shifted dramatically. You wouldn't, Richard said. Watch me. Margaret's finger hovered over her contact list. Let's see how your voters feel about a man who thinks psychiatric institutions are the solution for women who show inconvenient compassion. Margaret, think about what you're doing, Patricia Brennan said, her professional composure finally cracking. Think about the consequences, the scandal, the damage to innocent people. Emily is innocent people, Margaret said. She's 7 years old and she's been betrayed by every adult who was supposed to protect her. I won't be another name on that list. Richard stood up slowly, his political instincts finally kicking in. He understood leverage, and he was looking at a woman who had just discovered she had more than he'd realized. What do you want? He asked. I want Emily back. I want the legal proceedings dropped. I want to be left alone to raise her the way Caroline would have wanted. And if we agree to that, Margaret looked at her husband, this stranger she had lived with for 25 years, this man who had turned love into a political liability and felt the last chains of her old life fall away. Then you get your divorce quietly and your reputation intact. Your campaign continues without scandal. Your political future remains bright. She paused, meeting his eyes. But Emily and I disappear from your world completely. No more photo opportunities, no more perfect political wife, no more pretending we're something we're not. The room was quiet, except for the sound of Morrison's rapid breathing and the distant traffic from Michigan Avenue. Margaret watched Richard calculate the costs and benefits, weighing his love for power against whatever small affection he might still feel for her. It took him less than 30 seconds to choose. Done, he said. Doctor. Faulkner packed up her tablet without a word. Morrison made notes about damage control and narrative management. Patricia Brennan began drafting papers that would undo everything they had spent the morning building. As they filed out of her apartment, Richard paused at the door. You're making a mistake, Margaret. That child will break your heart. She's damaged, probably beyond repair. She'll never be the daughter you're dreaming of. Margaret smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd worn in his presence in years. Richard, you still don't understand. I'm not trying to save Emily because I think she's perfect. I'm trying to save her because love doesn't require perfection. It only requires presence. After they left, Margaret sat alone in her living room, looking at Caroline's locket and thinking about the phone call she was about to make to the group home, the papers she would sign, the life she was about to build from scratch. For the first time in decades, the future felt uncertain. For the first time in decades, that felt like hope. Margaret drove through Chicago's late afternoon traffic, with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The Riverside group home sat in a neighborhood she had never visited. Despite living in the city for over 2 decades, a part of Chicago where hope came with security bars on windows, and children learned early that adults made promises they rarely kept. The building was institutional beige, the kind of color chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention or inspiring emotion. Margaret parked across the street and sat in her car for several minutes, watching children through chain-link fencing as they played in a concrete courtyard. Their laughter sounded forced, performative, as if they had learned that appearing happy made adults more comfortable with the system that had failed them. The woman who answered the door introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, the facility director. She was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe 40, with tired eyes that suggested she had started this job believing she could save every child and had learned the brutal mathematics of institutional care. Too many children, too little funding, too few people who genuinely cared. "Mrs. Thompson," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carefully neutral, "I have to say I'm surprised to see you here. I've come for Emily. I'm afraid that's not possible. The child is in state custody, pending placement in a more appropriate long-term facility. Only authorized personnel and court-approved family members are allowed visitation." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out the legal documents Patricia Brennan had rushed to complete that afternoon. "I think you'll find I'm now court-approved." Mrs. Chen read through the papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate bureaucracy as a survival skill. Her expression shifted from suspicion to confusion to something that might have been relief. "This is unusual," she said finally. "Most people don't fight this hard to take custody of a child who isn't biologically theirs. Emily isn't just any child. She's my goddaughter. I made a promise to her mother." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "She's been asking for you every day. Some of the other children started calling her Margaret Girl, because that's the only word she seems to know anymore." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She followed Mrs. Chen through hallways that smelled of industrial disinfectant and institutional food, past common rooms where children sat in small groups that spoke to hierarchies and alliances formed out of necessity rather than affection. Emily was in what Mrs. Chen called the quiet room, a euphemism for the place where children were sent when their grief became inconvenient for group management. She sat on a plastic chair that was too big for her, staring out a window that offered a view of the parking lot. She had lost weight in the 5 days since Margaret had last seen her, her face gaunt in a way that made her look even younger and more vulnerable. "Emily," Margaret said softly. The little girl turned, and for a moment her face was blank, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Then her expression crumpled, and she launched herself across the room into Margaret's arms with a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her small body. "You came back," Emily whispered against Margaret's shoulder. "I didn't think you would come back. I promised you I would. Adults don't keep promises, not to kids like me." Margaret knelt down so she was at Emily's eye level, taking the child's small face in her hands. "What kind of kid are you, Emily? The kind nobody keeps." The words were matter-of-fact, delivered with the devastating honesty of someone who had learned the worst lessons about human nature before she'd lost her first tooth. Margaret felt something break open in her chest, not her heart, which had been breaking slowly for days, but something deeper. The last remnant of the woman who had spent 25 years accepting other people's definitions of what mattered. "Emily Grace," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You are the kind of kid who deserves everything. You are the kind of kid who makes pancakes taste better, and laughter sound sweeter, and hearts grow bigger. You are the kind of kid who reminds adults what love is supposed to feel like." Emily stared at her with those ancient eyes, searching for lies or false promises, or the kind of adult manipulation she had learned to recognize. "Do you mean it?" "I mean it more than I've ever meant anything in my life." But even as Margaret spoke the words, she could see Mrs. Chen shifting uncomfortably behind them, checking her watch and glancing toward the hallway. The legal papers might grant Margaret custody, but removing Emily from the system required procedures, protocols, oversight that could take hours or days. "How long before we can go home?" Margaret asked. "Well, there are forms to complete, medical records to transfer, educational assessments to review. Normally this process takes several days, but given the unusual circumstances..." Mrs. Chen trailed off, studying Margaret's face. "Are you in some kind of hurry?" Margaret thought about Richard's political instincts, his ability to change course when circumstances shifted. The agreement they had reached that morning was built on mutual self-interest, but self-interest was notoriously unstable. How long before he decided that controlling the narrative meant controlling Emily again? "Mrs. Chen," Margaret said carefully, "if I told you that there were people who might try to reverse this custody arrangement, people with significant political influence who might pressure the system to delay Emily's release, what would you tell me?" Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, looking at Emily, who had pressed herself against Margaret's side, as if she could make herself permanently attached through sheer force of will. I would tell you, Mrs. Chen said finally, that sometimes the system works faster when the right person is motivated to make it work. And I would tell you that I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I've never seen a child fight so hard against placement as Emily did. She's been here 5 days and she's barely eaten, barely spoken to anyone except to ask when you were coming back. She paused, looking directly at Margaret. I would also tell you that in 8 years, I've never had someone with legal standing show up demanding custody within a week of placement. Usually we're lucky if we get a phone call. Margaret understood. Mrs. Chen was offering to expedite the process, to cut through the bureaucratic delays that could keep Emily trapped in the system indefinitely. But she was also asking for assurance that this wasn't another false start, another adult who would disappear when the responsibility became inconvenient. Mrs. Chen, I spent 5 days knowing Emily was here, crying for me, and being unable to do anything about it. I will never let that happen again. Mrs. Chen nodded and picked up her phone. Let me make some calls. While they waited, Emily showed Margaret around the facility with the resigned efficiency of someone giving a tour of a place she never wanted to see again. She pointed out the cafeteria, where children ate meals that were nutritionally adequate but emotionally barren. The common room where television provided distraction from the reality of displacement. The dormitory where 8 children shared space designed for 4. This is where I sleep, Emily said, pointing to a bottom bunk bed. Sarah sleeps up there. She's been here for 2 years. She says some kids never leave. Margaret looked at the narrow bed with its thin mattress and institutional blankets, trying to imagine Emily lying there night after night, staring at the ceiling and wondering why no one wanted her enough to fight for her. Emily, I need you to know something, Margaret said. Even if I hadn't been able to get you back today, even if the legal system had kept us apart, I would never have stopped trying. I would have spent every day for the rest of my life working to bring you home. Why? It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of every abandonment Emily had experienced, every broken promise, every adult who had treated her like a temporary inconvenience rather than a human being deserving of love. Because your mother was the best person I've ever known, Margaret said. Because she trusted me to take care of you if something happened to her. Because you deserve to be someone's priority, not someone's burden. And because, she paused, searching for words that could capture the truth she was only beginning to understand herself. Because when I look at you, I remember who I used to be before I learned to be afraid of caring too much. You make me brave, Emily. You make me better. Emily was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and wrapped in tissue paper. I made this for you, she said shyly. Inside the tissue was a bracelet made from small beads and string, the kind of craft project that filled time in institutional settings. But Emily had spelled out words with letter beads. Margaret plus Emily, family. Margaret slipped the bracelet over her wrist, and for the first time in days Emily smiled, really smiled, with her whole face lighting up in a way that made Margaret understand why people fought wars for love. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, holding a folder thick with completed paperwork. Ladies, she said, I believe it's time to go home. As they walked toward the exit, Emily's small hand tight in Margaret's, Mrs. Chen pulled Margaret aside. Mrs. Thompson, I've been doing this work long enough to recognize when someone is running from something versus running towards something. Which one are you? Margaret looked at Emily, who was saying goodbye to the other children with the solemn courtesy of someone who understood that she was escaping a fate they would continue to endure. Both, Margaret said honestly. I'm running away from a life that never fit, and running toward the person I was always supposed to be. Mrs. Chen smiled. That's the first honest answer I've gotten from an adult in months. Take care of her, Mrs. Thompson, and let her take care of you too. Kids like Emily, they know how to love fiercely because they know what it costs to lose it. As they drove away from the group home, Emily pressed her face to the window, watching the building disappear behind them. Margaret glanced in the rearview mirror and saw tears on the child's cheeks. Are you sad to leave? Margaret asked. No, Emily said. I'm crying because I'm happy, and I forgot what that felt like. Margaret reached back and took Emily's hand, feeling the small bones and soft skin that represented everything she had never known she wanted. Emily Grace, we're going to remember together. The apartment felt different when they returned that evening, not smaller but somehow more complete, as if Emily's presence had filled spaces Margaret hadn't realized were empty. They sat at the kitchen counter, eating grilled cheese sandwiches that Margaret had burned slightly on one side, and Emily declared them the best sandwiches she'd ever tasted with the solemnity of someone making an official proclamation. "Can I really stay this time?" Emily asked, picking apart the crust with careful fingers. "You won't have to give me back." "Never," Margaret said, and the word felt like a promise carved in stone. "But Emily, I need to tell you something. My life is going to change now. We're going to have to leave this apartment soon. I won't have as much money as I used to. Things are going to be different." Emily looked around at the marble countertops and crystal chandelier, at the abundance that had probably cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. "Will we still have food?" she asked. "Yes, we'll always have food." "And a place to sleep?" "Yes." "Together?" "Together." Emily nodded with the practical acceptance of someone who had learned to calibrate her expectations to reality. "Then it doesn't matter about the other stuff. The fancy things don't make you warm at night." Over the following weeks, as lawyers finalized divorce papers and accountants divided assets, Margaret discovered the peculiar freedom that came with losing everything she had thought mattered. Richard kept the penthouse, the investment portfolio, the social connections that had defined her identity for 2 decades. Margaret got her personal belongings, a modest settlement that would last perhaps 2 years if she was careful, and Emily. It was the best trade of her life. They found a small 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, in a building where children rode bicycles in the hallways and neighbors knew each other's names. The walls were painted basic white instead of designer colors, and the kitchen appliances were older than Emily, but there was a window in the living room that caught the morning sun just right, and Emily declared it perfect. "It feels like a home," she said, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of what would be her bedroom. "Not like a museum where you're afraid to touch anything." Margaret enrolled Emily at the neighborhood elementary school, where she quickly distinguished herself as a child who was hungry for learning in ways that went beyond academics. She read voraciously, as if trying to make up for years of educational disruption. She asked questions that revealed a mind sharp enough to cut glass, and a curiosity that had somehow survived systematic disappointment, but it was Emily's capacity for kindness that astonished Margaret most. At school she gravitated toward the lonely children, the ones who sat alone at lunch or stood by themselves during recess. She seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of what it felt like to be overlooked, and she used that knowledge like a superpower, making invisible children visible through the simple act of paying attention. "There's a boy in my class named Marcus," Emily told Margaret one evening, while they worked on homework together at their small kitchen table. "He never brings lunch, and he pretends he's not hungry, but I can tell he is. What do you think we should do about that?" Emily considered this with the seriousness of someone solving a complex equation. "Maybe I could pack extra food in my lunch, but not in a way that makes him feel bad about needing it." Margaret helped Emily devise a system of accidentally packing too much food and offering to share, of suggesting they eat lunch together because she didn't like eating alone. Within a week, Marcus was bringing his own lunch. His grandmother had started packing extra once she understood the situation, but the friendship that had formed around shared sandwiches lasted much longer than the need for food. Margaret found work at a non-profit organization that helped families navigate the foster care system. The pay was a fraction of what she had been accustomed to having access to, but the work felt meaningful in ways that charity galas and fundraising committees never had. She helped parents who had lost children to the system, grandparents seeking custody of grandchildren, teenagers aging out of care with nowhere to go. "You understand something most people in this business don't," her supervisor, Linda Rodriguez, told her, after Margaret had spent an entire Saturday helping a single mother complete the mountain of paperwork required to regain custody of her twins. "You know what it feels like to fight a system that's designed to exhaust you into giving up." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that her own experience with custody battles and legal intimidation had become the foundation for helping others navigate similar challenges. Every case felt personal, every family reunification a small victory against the forces that tried to separate people who belonged together. In the evenings, she and Emily established routines that were simple but sacred. Dinner together at their small table, with Emily sharing the details of her day, and Margaret listening with the attention of someone who had learned that children's stories were often the most important ones. Homework side by side, with Margaret discovering that helping a 7-year-old with math problems was infinitely more satisfying than balancing investment portfolios. Bedtime stories were a revelation. Emily was fascinated by fairy tales, but she always wanted to discuss the logic of the plots, the motivations of the characters, the practical implications of magic solutions. "Why didn't Cinderella just leave before midnight?" she asked one night, as Margaret read from a collection of classic stories. "If she knew the magic would stop working, why did she wait until the last minute? What do you think?" Emily considered this seriously. Maybe she was afraid that if she left too early, she'd never get to experience the beautiful part again. Maybe she thought it was worth the risk of losing everything to have a few more minutes of being happy. Margaret looked at this wise little girl who understood the mathematics of hope and loss better than most adults, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "You know what I think," Margaret said. "I think Cinderella was brave. It takes courage to believe in beautiful moments, especially when you know they might not last." "Like us?" Emily asked quietly. "Like us." But their beautiful moments were threatened from an unexpected direction. 3 months after the custody agreement was finalized, Margaret received a call from Patricia Brennan, the lawyer who had once tried to have her declared mentally unfit. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm calling as a courtesy to inform you that questions have been raised about Emily's placement. There are concerns about the stability of her current environment." Margaret's blood turned cold. "What kind of concerns?" "Your financial situation has changed dramatically. You're working at a non-profit, living in modest circumstances. There are people who believe Emily might be better served in a placement with more resources, more opportunities." "Who? Who is raising these concerns?" There was a pause. "I'm not at liberty to say, but there will be a review. A caseworker will be in touch to schedule a home visit." The home visit was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon when Emily was at school. Margaret spent the weekend cleaning their small apartment until it gleamed, organizing Emily's schoolwork to demonstrate her academic progress, preparing documentation of Emily's medical care and social development. The caseworker was a woman named Janet Morrison, no relation to Richard's campaign manager, she assured Margaret, though the coincidence felt ominous. She was thorough in her inspection, checking the refrigerator for adequate food, examining Emily's bedroom for appropriate furnishings, reviewing the school reports that showed Emily was thriving academically and socially. "This is quite a change from your previous living situation," Morrison observed, making notes on her tablet. "Significant reduction in square footage, household income, available resources. Emily and I are very happy here," Margaret said. "She's excelling in school, she's made friends, she's healthy and loved." "Love doesn't pay for college," Morrison replied, "or medical emergencies, or the kind of opportunities that children from affluent families take for granted." Margaret felt the familiar rage building in her chest, the fury at a system that measured love in dollars, that assumed financial resources were more important than emotional security. "Miss Morrison, Emily spent the first 7 years of her life in poverty and neglect, bounced between foster homes and institutions. She has never been healthier or happier than she is right now. Are you seriously suggesting that she should be removed from a stable, loving home because we live in a smaller apartment? I'm suggesting that we need to consider what's in Emily's best long-term interests. There are families on the adoption waiting list with significant resources, families who could provide private schools, college funds, international travel opportunities, and none of those things matter if the child doesn't feel loved." Morrison continued her inspection, but Margaret could see her struggling with something. Finally, as she was preparing to leave, she turned back to Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson, can I speak frankly?" Margaret nodded. "I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've seen children in mansions who were emotionally neglected, and children in studio apartments who were treasured beyond measure. In my professional opinion, Emily Grace is exactly where she needs to be." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "But my professional opinion isn't the only factor in decisions like this. Sometimes political pressure creates outcomes that have nothing to do with what's best for the child." Margaret understood. Richard might have agreed to the divorce, but his political instincts were telling him that having his ex-wife living modestly while raising a child could become a liability if his opponents chose to make it one. Better to place Emily with a wealthy family who could be counted on not to embarrass him with their circumstances. That evening, Margaret sat Emily down at their kitchen table for the most difficult conversation of their time together. "Emily, do you remember when I told you that sometimes powerful people try to separate families because they can?" Emily nodded solemnly. "There are people who think you might be happier living with a different family. A family with more money, a bigger house, more things." Emily was quiet for a long time, tracing patterns on the table with her finger. When she looked up, her eyes were fierce. "Do they think I'm stupid?" What do you mean? Do they think I don't know the difference between having things and being wanted? Do they think I can't tell when someone loves me? Emily's voice was getting stronger, more determined. I lived in big houses before, with people who had lots of money, and I was hungry every day, because they didn't care if I ate. I had my own room, but I cried myself to sleep every night because nobody cared if I was sad. She stood up and walked to Margaret, climbing into her lap with the determined purpose of someone making a point. Margaret, you teach me things every day. You help me with homework. You read me stories. You make me feel like I matter. You get excited when I do well in school, and you hug me when I'm scared. You make pancakes on Saturday mornings and let me help, even when I make a mess. Emily paused, looking directly into Margaret's eyes. The people who want to take me away don't know any of that, do they? They just see a poor lady and a kid, and they think that's all we are, but we're a family, and families don't get measured by how much money they have. Margaret held Emily close, feeling the fierce strength in her small body, marveling at this child who had learned to recognize love in its truest form. You're right, sweetheart. We are a family, and tomorrow we're going to fight to stay that way. The courtroom was smaller than Margaret had expected, but it felt enormous when she and Emily walked in that grey Thursday morning. The institutional green walls and fluorescent lighting seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who entered seeking justice. Margaret had spent her last savings on a lawyer, Sarah Chen, a young public defender who specialized in family law and had a reputation for fighting impossible cases with the tenacity of someone who believed every child deserved an advocate. Emily wore the blue dress Margaret had bought her for school pictures, her hair carefully braided. Her small hands clutched around a folder of drawings she had insisted on bringing. She looked impossibly young sitting in the wooden chair beside Margaret, her feet barely touching the floor, but her spine was straight, and her chin lifted with determination that reminded Margaret powerfully of Caroline at that age. On the other side of the courtroom sat the Hendersons, Robert and Patricia Henderson, both in their early 50s, both wearing the kind of expensive, understated clothing that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. Robert was a successful surgeon, Patricia a former teacher, who now managed their family foundation. They had been trying to adopt for 5 years, their lawyer explained, and they could provide Emily with every advantage money could buy. Your Honor, their attorney, David Walsh, began in the measured tones of someone accustomed to winning. While we appreciate Mrs. Thompson's affection for the child, we must consider Emily's long-term needs. The Hendersons can offer private education at the finest schools, a college fund already established with $500,000, summer enrichment programs, travel opportunities, cultural experiences that will expand her horizons in ways her current situation simply cannot provide. He gestured toward a thick folder of documents. They have undergone extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, home studies by certified social workers. Their estate includes a 4-acre property with a swimming pool, tennis court, and stable for horseback riding. Emily would have her own wing of the house, complete with a library and art studio. Margaret felt Emily's small hand slip into hers under the table. The child was listening to this catalogue of advantages with the careful attention of someone who had learned that adults often talked about her as if she weren't there. Furthermore, Walsh continued, Mrs. Thompson's financial situation has deteriorated significantly since she gained custody. She's living in a 2-bedroom apartment, working at a non-profit with minimal earning potential, no savings or investments to speak of. While her intentions may be admirable, intentions don't pay for college or provide security in times of crisis. Judge Catherine Morrison, a woman in her 60s with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much human suffering to be impressed by theatrical presentations, listened without expression. She had been a family court judge for 20 years, and Margaret could see the weariness of someone who had to make impossible decisions about children's futures on a regular basis. Mrs. Thompson, Judge Morrison said when Walsh finished his presentation, you'll have an opportunity to respond, but first, I'd like to hear from Emily herself. The courtroom fell silent. Emily looked up at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly, then stood up with the careful dignity of someone addressing royalty. Your Honor, Emily said, her small voice clear in the quiet room. May I show you something? Judge Morrison smiled, the first warm expression Margaret had seen from her. Of course, Emily. Come up here. Emily walked to the front of the courtroom, carrying her folder of drawings. She opened it carefully and pulled out a piece of construction paper covered in crayon drawings. This is my family, she said, holding up the paper so everyone could see. The drawing showed two stick figures holding hands in front of a small house. One figure had long brown hair and was labelled Margaret in careful block letters. The smaller figure had shorter hair and was labelled Emily. Between them, connecting their hands, was a heart drawn in red crayon. Before I lived with Margaret, I used to draw pictures of families, but I always had to make them up because I didn't have one. These people, she gestured toward the Hendersons without looking at them, they seem very nice and they have a lot of money and a big house, but they don't know me. Emily pulled out another drawing, this one showing the two stick figures sitting at a small table with what appeared to be books between them. Margaret knows that I like to read before breakfast because it makes me feel calm. She knows that I'm afraid of thunderstorms, but only the really loud ones. She knows that I like to help cook dinner because it makes me feel useful. She knows that I had nightmares for the first month, and she would sit with me until I fell back asleep, even when she had to work early the next day. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to listen. Emily reached into her folder again and pulled out a photograph, the picture from Caroline's locket, now carefully placed in a small frame. This is my mama, with Margaret when they were young. My mama told me before she died that Margaret would take care of me if something happened, not because she had a lot of money or a big house, but because she knew how to love people even when it was hard. Emily turned to look directly at the Hendersons for the first time. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, I know you want to help me, and that's really nice, but I already have a family. Margaret isn't trying to adopt me because she wants a daughter to make her happy. She's taking care of me because she promised my mama she would, and because she loves me even when I'm sad or scared or difficult. She walked back to Margaret and climbed into her chair, settling against Margaret's side with the naturalness of a child who had found her place in the world. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the drawings Emily had left on her desk. Mrs. Henderson, she said finally, I understand you've prepared a statement about why you believe Emily should be placed with your family. Patricia Henderson stood up, her hands shaking slightly. She was an elegant woman with kind eyes, and Margaret could see that she genuinely cared about Emily's welfare. Your Honor, my husband and I have wanted a child for many years. We've prepared extensively for this opportunity. We have resources, stability, a support system that could give Emily every advantage. She paused, looking at Emily with obvious affection. But listening to her speak today, I realize we've been thinking about what we could give her, not what she needs from us. She turned to her husband, who nodded encouragingly. Emily clearly has something with Mrs. Thompson that can't be measured in dollars or square footage. She has belonging. She has someone who sees her as an individual, not as a project or an opportunity to express parental love. Patricia's voice was growing stronger. Your Honor, we withdraw our petition for custody. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Emily looked up at Margaret with wide eyes. Does that mean we get to stay together? But Judge Morrison held up her hand for silence. Mrs. Henderson, are you certain about this decision? Yes, Your Honor. We want to help Emily, but not by taking her away from the family she's already found. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as Patricia Henderson walked over to their table. Mrs. Thompson, Patricia said quietly, Robert and I would like to establish a college fund for Emily, if you'll allow it, not as an attempt to buy our way into her life, but as an investment in her future, from people who recognize that she's exactly where she belongs. Judge Morrison reviewed the paperwork for several minutes, occasionally glancing at Emily, who had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder with the exhaustion of someone who had fought her hardest battle and won. Mrs. Thompson, the judge said finally, it's not often that I see a case where the answer is this clear. Emily's attachment to you is obvious, as is your commitment to her welfare. The court finds that Emily Grace Morrison is thriving in your care and that her best interests are served by remaining with you permanently. She stamped the final adoption papers with the decisive authority of someone rendering justice. Congratulations. You're officially a family. Margaret woke Emily gently. Sweetheart, we can go home now. Emily rubbed her eyes and looked around the courtroom, taking in the smiles on the faces around her, the finality in Judge Morrison's voice. Forever? She asked. Forever, Margaret confirmed. As they gathered their things to leave, Sarah Chen, their lawyer, pulled Margaret aside. Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, when you first took Emily in, did you have any idea it would lead to all this? The divorce, the financial upheaval, the legal battles? Margaret looked at Emily, who was carefully putting her drawings back in their folder, treating each one like a precious document. Sarah, 6 months ago I was living a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. I had everything money could buy, and nothing that mattered. Now I have everything that matters, and just enough money to get by." She paused, watching Emily wave goodbye to Judge Morrison, who had come down from her bench to shake the little girl's hand. "If someone had told me that keeping a promise to my dead best friend would cost me my marriage, my social status, and my financial security, would I have done it anyway?" Margaret smiled. "I would have done it faster." Outside the courthouse, Emily stopped on the steps and looked up at the cloudy Chicago sky. "Margaret, do you think my mama knows what happened today?" Margaret knelt down beside her, pulling Emily's jacket close against the autumn wind. "I think she's been watching over us this whole time, making sure we found each other when we needed each other most." Emily nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Can we have pancakes for dinner tonight, to celebrate?" "Emily Grace, we can have pancakes for dinner every night for the rest of our lives if you want." Emily giggled, the first completely carefree sound Margaret had heard from her, and took Margaret's hand. "I don't want them every night," she said, as they walked toward their car. "But I want to know I could have them if I wanted. That's what family means, right? Knowing that the people who love you will say yes when it matters." Margaret squeezed Emily's hand, thinking about all the ways this wise little girl continued to teach her about love. "That's exactly what family means, sweetheart, and we're going to spend the rest of our lives saying yes to each other." 2 years later, Margaret stood in the kitchen of their small apartment, watching Emily carefully measure flour for Saturday morning pancakes. At 9 years old, Emily had grown taller and more confident, but she still approached cooking with the serious concentration of someone who remembered what it felt like to be hungry. The morning sun streamed through their east-facing window, catching the dust motes that danced between them like tiny celebrations of the ordinary miracle of home. "Margaret," Emily said, not looking up from her measuring cup, "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you'll speak at the conference next month." Linda Rodriguez, Margaret's supervisor at the non-profit, had been encouraging Margaret to share her story at national conferences about foster care reform. The idea terrified Margaret, standing before hundreds of social workers, lawyers, and advocates, exposing the most painful and private parts of her journey. But Emily had been the one to convince her. "You could help other kids like me," Emily had said with the practical wisdom that continued to amaze Margaret. "You could help other grown-ups remember that love is more important than money." The conference was being held in downtown Chicago, in the same hotel where Margaret had once attended charity galas as Richard's wife, wearing designer gowns and making small talk about causes she supported financially but had never truly understood. The irony wasn't lost on her that she would be returning to that world as someone who had chosen purpose over prestige, authenticity over appearance. The speech had been difficult to write. How do you explain to strangers that losing everything you thought you wanted was the key to finding everything you actually needed? How do you describe the moment when a 7-year-old child's hunger for pancakes revealed the poverty of your own spirit? On the morning of the conference, Emily helped Margaret choose her outfit, a simple navy blue dress from Target that Emily declared perfect because it looks like you, not like you're pretending to be someone else. They had breakfast together at their small kitchen table, the same routine they had maintained for 2 years, the ritual that had become the foundation of their shared life. "Are you nervous?" Emily asked, watching Margaret push her pancakes around her plate without eating. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "Good," Emily said matter-of-factly. "That means it's important." The hotel ballroom was filled with social workers, attorneys, child advocates, and foster parents, people who had dedicated their lives to fixing a system that broke children's hearts with bureaucratic efficiency. Margaret looked out at the sea of faces and felt the familiar flutter of panic that had preceded every public appearance during her years as a political wife. But then she saw Emily in the front row, sitting next to Linda Rodriguez, her small hands folded in her lap and her face bright with pride and encouragement. Margaret remembered the first time she had seen Emily, standing beside her table at that expensive restaurant, asking for leftover food with the dignity of someone who refused to be ashamed of her circumstances. 3 years ago, Margaret began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I was living what most people would consider a perfect life: penthouse apartment, unlimited resources, social status, a husband who was running for the United States Senate. I had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered." She told them about Caroline's death, about her failure to keep a promise to her dying friend, about the voice message that had shattered her carefully constructed world. She spoke about the legal battles, the psychiatric evaluations, the way the system had been weaponized to separate her from Emily simply because she lacked the right kind of power. The people who tried to take Emily away from me weren't evil, Margaret said, looking directly at the audience. They were operating from a belief system that measures love in dollars, that assumes financial resources are more important than emotional security. They couldn't understand that a child who had been abandoned and abused and passed between institutions didn't need more things. She needed someone who would choose her every single day, no matter what it cost. She paused, glancing at Emily, who was listening with the serious attention of someone hearing a story she had lived but never heard told from this perspective. Emily taught me that love isn't about what you can afford to give someone. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to keep them. It's about showing up every day, even when, especially when, the rest of the world is telling you to walk away. The question and answer session that followed was intense. Social workers shared stories of children lost to bureaucracy, of families destroyed by systems designed to protect them. Attorneys talked about legal reforms needed to prioritize emotional bonds over financial status. Foster parents spoke about the heartbreak of loving children they might not be allowed to keep. But the question that stopped Margaret cold came from a young woman in the back of the room. "Mrs. Thompson, do you ever regret your decision? Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had chosen differently?" Margaret looked at Emily, who was watching with the careful attention of someone whose sense of security still depended on constant reassurance that she was wanted. "I regret that it took me so long to make the right choice," Margaret said. "I regret the years I spent prioritizing appearance over substance, the time I wasted being the person other people expected me to be instead of the person I was meant to be. But choosing Emily, fighting for Emily, rebuilding my life around love instead of status," she smiled at her daughter. "That's the only decision I've ever made that I'm completely certain was right." After the conference, they walked through downtown Chicago together, past the restaurant where they had first met, past the building where Margaret used to live in her penthouse prison. Emily wanted to stop at the public library, a place that had become their weekend refuge where they could spend hours reading together without spending money they didn't have. In the children's section, Emily found a book about a little girl who lived with her grandmother, and she curled up in Margaret's lap to read it together. Other families surrounded them, parents and children sharing stories, grandparents teaching grandchildren to love books, the quiet democracy of public spaces where everyone belonged regardless of their ability to pay. "Margaret," Emily said quietly, not looking up from the book, "do you think other kids like me will get to find families like ours?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Kids who don't have money or fancy clothes or the right last names. Kids who've been in lots of different houses but never had a home. Do you think grown-ups will learn to see us the way you see me?" Margaret felt the familiar ache in her chest that came whenever Emily's questions revealed how much she understood about the inequities that had shaped her young life. "I think some grown-ups already do see you that way," Margaret said, "and I think your story, our story, might help others remember what's really important when they're making decisions about children's lives." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why all the bad stuff happened, so we could help fix it for other kids." 3 months later, Margaret received a call that would validate Emily's optimism in the most unexpected way. Patricia Henderson, the woman who had withdrawn her custody petition in court, was on the line with a proposal that took Margaret's breath away. "Mrs. Thompson," Patricia said, "Robert and I have been thinking about your speech at the conference, about what you said regarding the need for advocacy that prioritizes emotional bonds over financial status. We'd like to fund a foundation, the Emily Grace Foundation, that would provide legal representation for families fighting custody battles where love is being challenged by economics." Margaret sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, staring at Emily, who was doing homework at the table, completely unaware that her name was about to become synonymous with hope for families like theirs. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider running it. Say you'll use your experience to help other children stay with the people who love them, regardless of their bank account balances." That evening, Margaret and Emily sat on their small balcony, watching the sunset paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and pink. Emily was reading, as she always did in the evenings, her small body curled against Margaret's side, with the unconscious trust of someone who had found her safe harbor. "Emily," Margaret said quietly, "how would you feel if we started an organization to help other kids who are in situations like you were, kids who need advocates who understand that families are built on love, not money?" Emily looked up from her book, her eyes bright with the intelligence that had impressed every teacher she'd ever had. Would we help kids stay with people who really want them? That's exactly what we would do. Emily was quiet for a moment, thinking with the careful consideration she brought to every important decision. I think Mama would like that, she said finally. I think she'd like knowing that something good came from all the sad stuff that happened. Margaret pulled Emily closer, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, still amazed that this wise, brave little girl was hers to love and protect. What do you think we should call it? The Emily Grace Foundation, Emily said without hesitation. Because grace means getting something good that you didn't earn, right? And that's what family is. It's love you get just for being yourself, not because you're perfect or rich or easy to take care of. Margaret smiled, thinking about how this child continued to teach her profound truths with the casual wisdom of someone who had learned the most important lessons through experience rather than education. 5 years later, the Emily Grace Foundation had helped keep over 300 children with their chosen families. Margaret testified before Congress about foster care reform. Emily, now 14, volunteered at the Foundation's weekend programs, using her own story to help younger children understand that their worth wasn't measured by their circumstances, but their greatest victory was smaller and more personal. Every Saturday morning, they still made pancakes together in their kitchen, now expanded to include friends Emily had brought home from school, kids from the Foundation who needed a safe place to spend the weekend, anyone who needed to know what family felt like. On one such Saturday, as Margaret watched Emily teaching a shy 8-year-old how to flip pancakes without making a mess, she thought about the voice message that had started their journey. I'm going to find something better, Richard had said, and in his own twisted way he had been right. His abandonment had forced Margaret to find something better, not in terms of status or wealth, but in terms of purpose and meaning and love. Emily caught her watching and smiled, the same radiant expression that had convinced Margaret years ago that some promises were worth keeping no matter what they cost. "Okay, Margaret," Emily called across the kitchen, "remember when you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up? You said you wanted to be the kind of person who helps kids find their families." "I changed my mind," Emily said, grinning as she helped the younger child add chocolate chips to the batter. "I want to be the kind of person who helps families find each other, like you did for us." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around their kitchen. Not the fanciest space, not the most expensive ingredients, but filled with laughter and safety and the knowledge that everyone there was exactly where they belonged. Sometimes, she realized, finding something better meant discovering that you already had everything you needed. You just had to be brave enough to choose love over comfort, connection over status, purpose over prestige. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a story where someone had to choose between what looked successful on the outside and what felt meaningful on the inside? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us share these messages of hope with people who need to hear them. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.